Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take complex topics, grab the source material, and make sure you walk away feeling thoroughly informed. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are wading into one of the most critical, yet, let's be honest, jargon-heavy components of the K-12 system. We're talking about the systematic process of assessment and evaluation for students who have, or are suspected of having, disabilities. If you've ever felt, a bit lost looking at those pages of standardized scores, observations, checklists that make up an individualized education program and IEP, well, you're definitely not alone.
It can feel like a maze.
Exactly. So our mission today is pretty simple. We want to give you a clear, step-by-step framework, help you understand the necessity, the specific types of tools used, and importantly, the really stringent legal guardrails that govern this whole process.
And that clarity is just paramount, because the stakes couldn't be higher, really. Assessment in this context isn't just about paperwork. It's the non-negotiable foundation for basically every informed decision made about a student's education. It's how we systematically gather and analyze information. The goal is making sure we're correctly identifying needs and, maybe most critically, providing the appropriate and effective educational experience they are legally entitled to receive under federal law.
Absolutely. And before we even touch on legal requirements or, interpreting specific scores, we have to start with something foundational. It's this linguistic distinction that honestly causes so much confusion, the difference between assessment and evaluation.
Yes.
Big one. People use them interchangeably all the time in just, everyday language. But in educational practice, and especially in law, they serve fundamentally separate functions.
That's right. Getting this distinction clear from the outset is key. So let's break down the definitions and maybe more importantly, their function. Assessment at its core is the systematic, ongoing process of collecting information about a student. Now, the term itself gets used in a couple of ways. First, it can refer to the specific tool you might use, like, say, a vision screening test, or maybe a reading fluency test, or even a checklist of social skills. That's the noun form, the thing itself.
The instrument.
Exactly. But second, and maybe more broadly, assessment refers to the whole process of gathering that information over time. Like, administering a state achievement test is part of the assessment process.
Got it. So tool or process. But you mentioned function being key. What's the functional difference?
Right. Functionally, assessment is characterized as this ongoing process. Its main focus is monitoring student learning as it's happening.
Okay, like checking the map while you're still on the journey.
That's a great analogy. You're constantly checking the compass, to make course corrections along the way. The ultimate goal of assessment, therefore, is improvement. You identify strengths, you pinpoint weaknesses, all to guide the very next steps of instruction.
Which makes it formative. Is that the right term?
Precisely. Assessment is considered a formative activity. It shapes the learning as it occurs.
Okay, so if assessment is formative, guiding the journey, then evaluation must be the destination.
You nailed it. If assessment is formative, then evaluation is summative. Evaluation is all about determining what students have already achieved once that period of instruction is over.
Ah, okay.
Its purpose is to judge the extent of that achievement. It's assigning the final grade or making that final determination about whether a student met a specific benchmark or standard. It's more of a snapshot in time, a final measure.
Let's use that spelling example from the source material. I thought that made it really clear.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay, so if a teacher is assessing spelling ability, they're doing it throughout the semester, right? It's ongoing.
Right.
They're looking at the students' essays, their homework, maybe those weekly pretests.
Exactly. They're monitoring. Are they applying the phonics rules consistently? Are they still making those same tricky spelling errors week after week?
And that information, that assessment data, helps the teacher maybe reteach a concept or try a different approach.
Right. It informs instruction. It's formative.
Then the evaluation part comes at the very end.
Yep. The evaluation is simply assigning that final letter grade to the big, comprehensive spelling test at the end of the semester. That act of judging the extent of achievement based on that final summative performance, that's evaluation.
So they work together, assessment and evaluation, they're partners.
Definitely partners.
Okay.
Assessment guides the journey, helps you steer. Evaluation judges how well you reach the destination. You need both, but they do different jobs. Hashtag, tag, 1.2 YSS. The question's driving special education.
Okay, so we've established this whole complex, systematic, sometimes really time-intensive process of gathering data. Formative tools, summative tools. Why? Why do we do all this? The sources say it exists solely to answer specific, really critical questions about students who have or might have a disability.
That's the crux of it. Understanding these driving questions is like having the key to the whole system.
So these questions basically dictate the entire assessment path.
Pretty much, yeah. They're the roadmap for the entire special education identification and service delivery process. If you know the question you're trying to answer, you know what kind of information you need to gather.
Okay, so what's the first big question?
The first, and maybe the most foundational one, relates directly to progress. What is the extent of student progress? Are they actually moving forward in specific academic areas or maybe in behavior?
We need data for that, not just a feeling.
Exactly. We need hard data. Are they gaining skills at an adequate rate compared to peers or compared to their own past performance? Or are they flatlining, staying static? Because that signals a problem maybe with the instruction, maybe something else.
Okay, progress. What's next?
Second, we move into identification. The question becomes, which students need extra support? And crucially, in what specific targeted areas?
Specificity is key.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just say, oh, this child is struggling in math. We need assessment data to tell us why. Is it a calculation issue? Is it word problems, maybe number sense? The assessment has to pinpoint the deficit precisely.
Makes sense. So once we've pinpointed the deficit, what's the next question?
That leads directly to intervention. The question is, which approaches to providing extra support are actually likely to benefit this specific student?
Right, because what works for one student might not work for another.
Precisely. Does this particular student need, say, peer tutoring, or maybe some assistive technology? Or is it one-on-one instruction they need? Or maybe just a change in how the material is presented? The assessment data, ideally, should suggest the most promising path forward.
Okay, so we identify the need, we try an intervention. What's question 4?
Accountability. This links directly to that idea of progress monitoring we'll talk more about. The question is the current extra support effective?
We have to know if it's working.
We have an ethical and, frankly, a legal responsibility to know. If we implement a new reading strategy for, say, 6 weeks and that student's data hasn't budged, well, the answer is probably no, it's not effective. And we need to adjust that instruction immediately. We can't just keep doing something that isn't working.
That makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, the big eligibility question.
Yes, the ones that formalize the need for special education services under IDA. Question 5 is really 2 parts. Is the student eligible for special education services? And, if yes, are those specific services effective once they're implemented?
So it's a continuous cycle.
Absolutely. If the initial services aren't working, based on ongoing assessment data, the whole assessment loop might start again to figure out why that approach is failing and how the student's individualized education program, their IEP, needs to be modified. It's meant to be a dynamic, self-correcting process.
Wow, okay, so those 5 questions really do frame everything.
They really do. Progress, specific needs, effective approaches, checking effectiveness, and finally, eligibility and service effectiveness. That's the logic flow.
Okay, so we have these driving questions. Now, how do we actually get the answers? You mentioned earlier that the timing and purpose of an assessment determine what kind of information we get.
Exactly. To properly use all this data we're gathering, educators have to be really clear about when an assessment is given and what its specific job is. Our sources lay out 5 main purposes, or types, based on this timing and function.
All right, let's walk through them. What's the first type? Hashtag 2.1 screening and pre-referral assessments, early identification.
The first type is screening assessments. Think of these as the wide net early identification tools. They're usually administered to all students within a specific group, like maybe the whole 3rd grade or the entire school.
And typically done early on, right? Like at the start of the year.
Yeah, very often.
Yeah.
The classic example is the vision or hearing screening that happens for all incoming kindergartners in many districts.
Right, I remember those.
Screening is meant to be a quick check. The goal is just to identify, as efficiently as possible, any students who might be at risk and who need a closer look, maybe more observation or more in-depth assessment down the line.
So it's just a flag, not a diagnosis.
Precisely. And it's important to note, screening isn't always a formal test given to everyone. It can also be more individual. For instance, a teacher might systematically observe just one student's behavior over a few weeks because they have a gut feeling, based on professional judgment, that maybe an emotional disturbance is developing. That systematic observation is a form of screening.
Okay, so screening casts the net. What happens if it catches something, if a student is flagged?
Then we typically move to a really critical step, pre-referral assessments. This step kind of acts as a gatekeeper before jumping to a formal special education evaluation.
Gatekeepers, I like that. So these are done before any formal referral.
Correct. They're administered to individual students who've been flagged by screening or who are showing significant difficulties in the general classroom. It's a deeper look than just the initial screen.
And what's the function? Why not just go straight to the formal evaluation?
Well, it has a really important dual function. First, the pre-referral assessment helps determine which instructional modifications within the general education setting might help that struggling student.
So trying things out first.
Exactly. Maybe changing their seating, trying different materials, using a specific teaching approach.
Mhm.
If those modifications work, if the students start succeeding with those supports in place, great, they stay in general education, and the formal special ed referral might be avoided altogether.
And the second function.
The second function is critical for legal reasons. If those modifications fail to produce adequate progress, the pre-referral assessment process serves to systematically document all the extensive attempts that were made to support the student within the general education framework before special education placement is even considered.
So it shows you exhausted other options first.
Precisely. The key takeaway here, under the law, IDA, is that special education is designed and mandated to be the last resort, not the first stop. Pre-referral assessment helps ensure that happens. Hashtag 2.2, diagnostic, monitoring, and outcome assessments.
Okay, so pre-referral happens. Let's say the modifications weren't enough, or maybe the initial screening pointed to something pretty significant right away. What's next?
Then we enter what you might call the deep dive phase, diagnostic assessments. This is where we really aim to gain an in-depth understanding of a student's specific skills, their precise instructional needs, and their unique profile of strengths and weaknesses.
This sounds like where the more formal, standardized tests might come in.
Often, yes. Diagnostic testing frequently involves standardized tools, things like the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, WISC-4, for cognitive abilities, or perhaps the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, PPVTIV, to look closely at receptive language skills.
But you mentioned earlier it can't just be one test score.
Absolutely not. And this is mandated by law, by IDEA. Any significant eligibility decisions, like determining if a student qualifies for special education, must be based on information gathered from several different sources. A single standardized test score is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
That seems like a really vital point.
Yeah.
So, say a student is suspected of having a significant learning disability in reading comprehension. You wouldn't just give them one reading test and make the call.
Definitely not. That would be illegal and, frankly, unethical. The diagnostic phase requires gathering that standardized test data, yes, but alongside things like a thorough review of their school records over time, multiple detailed observations by teachers in different settings, and definitely in-depth interviews with parents or guardians. You need the whole picture to understand the true extent of the impairment and how it impacts them across different parts of their life.
Okay, diagnostic gives us the deep understanding. What comes after that or alongside it?
Next, we have progress monitoring assessments. Now, unlike diagnostic assessments, which are usually done less frequently, maybe once a year or even less, progress monitoring is all about high frequency.
High frequency, like how often?
Often weekly, sometimes even more frequently, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, but usually over a defined period. And they tend to focus intensely on one very specific skill area. Things like tracking oral reading fluency week by week, or monitoring accuracy in solving multi-step math problems, or even tracking a measurable behavioral target, like the amount of time a student spends on task during independent work.
And the purpose is checking if the interventions are working, like
Yeah.
we talked about the driving questions.
Exactly. Purpose number 4. Progress monitoring aims to determine if an individual student's rate of progress is adequate, given the specific instruction or intervention they are receiving. It's about accountability and calibration. Are we on the right track with this student?
And can these be formal tests or informal?
They can be both. Sometimes highly formal, standardized probes are used, like in curriculum-based measurement, which we'll get to. Other times they might be slightly more informal, like structured teacher-made quizzes or checklists, as long as they are administered and scored systematically and consistently.
Okay, makes sense. So that leaves one more type.
Right, the 5th type is outcome assessments. Now, these fall squarely under that definition of evaluation we started with.
Ah, the summative piece.
Exactly. Outcome assessments determine the extent of achievement at the end of a significant chunk of time, most often, say, the end of the school year, or maybe the end of a specific program. The goal is to judge the overall achievement, the final result.
And the classic example here would be the big state tests.
Yep. The most common and well-known examples are those state-mandated achievement tests, like the Florida Standards Assessment, FSA, mentioned in our sources, or whatever equivalent your state uses. These are generally given to almost all students in certain grades and are used primarily for judging school and district accountability, basically, how well the educational program worked for groups of students over the entire year.
Got it. So screening, pre-referral, diagnostic, progress monitoring, and outcome evaluation. 5 distinct purposes, 5 different roles in the process.
That's the framework. Each one provides a different lens on the student.
This brings us, I think, inevitably to the legal side of things. How must we legally and ethically conduct all these measurements? We're dealing with complex data, potentially life-altering decisions about eligibility. There have to be rules.
Oh, absolutely. The entire process is governed by really stringent federal regulations, primarily to ensure fairness, accuracy, and, importantly, protection for the student and their family. This isn't just best practice, it's the law. Hashtag tag 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 3.1 IDEA mandates for assessment.
And the main law here is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? IDEA.
Correct. IDEA provides a specific, very detailed legal checklist that every school district in the country has to follow when assessing students who might have exceptionalities. And when you actually look at this checklist, you realize the sheer administrative and professional responsibility schools carry just to ensure basic fairness and compliance. It's significant.
So what are some of the key requirements on that checklist? Where does it start?
It really starts with parental rights. Before initiating any assessment specifically for considering special education, anything beyond those routine screenings given to all students, school officials must provide prior written notice to the parents.
Notice.
And more than just notice, they must obtain explicit parental permission or consent before starting any of those specific evaluation procedures. You need informed, written consent. Parents have to agree to it.
That seems fundamental. What else? Who actually does the assessment?
Good question. IDA mandates that assessments must be conducted by an interdisciplinary team. This isn't just one person making the call. The team has to include professionals who are knowledgeable about the student's suspected disability.
So like a speech therapist if it's a communication issue.
Exactly. Or a school psychologist for a suspected cognitive impairment or learning disability. Maybe an occupational therapist if there are motor concerns. The right expertise has to be at the table.
And how is the assessment actually carried out?
The law is clear. It must be carried out on an individual basis. We're not doing mass group testing to determine eligibility for special education. It's focused on the individual child.
And crucially, you mentioned earlier, not relying on just one test.
Absolutely critical. The law explicitly requires that eligibility and placement decisions cannot be based on a single, isolated data point. They must use more than one test or criterion. This is a huge safeguard against labeling a student or denying them services based on, say, just one bad test day or one potentially flawed instrument.
That makes sense. What about bias? Tests can sometimes feel biased.
IDEA addresses that directly. Assessment materials and procedures must be explicitly non-discriminatory with respect to the student's racial, cultural, or linguistic background. This is huge.
How does that play out practically?
Well, for one, the assessment must be administered in the student's primary language or mode of communication, whether that's Spanish, sign language, or using an augmentative communication device, unless it's clearly not feasible to do so.
Why is that so important?
Because historically, and this is well documented, students were often misidentified as having intellectual disabilities when the real issue was simply a language barrier. They didn't understand the English instructions or the cultural context of the questions. The law demands we assess the student's actual ability, not their lack of English proficiency or unfamiliarity with mainstream culture.
Wow. Okay. What about the tests themselves? Are there rules about the quality of the tests used?
Yes. The assessment tools must be empirically validated for the specific purpose for which they are being used.
Wait.
Meaning, if a test claims it measures, say, reading comprehension, there has to be actual scientific evidence, research, backing up that claim. You can't just use any old test you find. And, equally important, they must only be administered by trained individuals who know exactly how to give the test according to its standardized instructions.
Following the instructions precisely.
Absolutely. Those standardized test protocols must be strictly adhered to. The only exception is when specific necessary accommodations are made for the student's disability, which is a whole topic in itself.
Okay. Any other key mandates from IDA?
One more specific one mentioned in our sources is For the youngest kids, children from birth to 3 years old who are in early intervention programs, for them, the assessment process must take place in their natural environments.
Natural environments, like at home.
Exactly, like at home or maybe at their daycare center. The idea is to see how the child functions in their typical everyday settings rather than pulling them into an artificial testing room to get the most accurate picture of their developmental needs. Hashtag 3.2 confidentiality and parental rights.
So the testing itself is tightly regulated. What about the results? Who gets to see them? How is privacy protected?
That's another area with strong legal safeguards. Federal laws, primarily IDEA again, but also the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, provide really stringent protections for the confidentiality of all assessment results and any other educational records related to the student.
And parents have rights here too, I assume.
Absolutely central rights. Parents have the absolute right to examine all assessment results and any records the school holds related to their child's identification, evaluation, and placement.
Examine them.
Yeah,
And to get help understanding them. Some of those reports look like Greek.
Yes. If parents request an explanation of the materials, like, what does this standard score actually mean? Or, can you explain this psychologist's report? The school is legally obligated to comply and provide that explanation in understandable terms, not just hand them a report full of jargon.
What if a parent thinks something in the record is wrong? Like factually inaccurate or misleading?
They have recourse. Parents have the right to request that the school amend a record if they believe it's inaccurate, misleading, or violates their child's privacy or other rights. There's a formal process for that.
And who gets access generally? Can just any teacher look up a student's disability information?
No, definitely not. Access is highly restricted. Generally, only parents and specific authorized school personnel can access these sensitive records.
Who counts as authorized personnel?
Usually, it's the teachers who are actively involved in the student's education, the relevant educational specialists working with the child, like the speech therapist or school psychologist, and certain administrators who have a legitimate educational interest. It's on a need-to-know basis.
And what about sharing information outside the school?
That requires explicit parental consent in almost all cases. The school must get written permission from the parent before disclosing assessment results or any other records that contain personally identifiable information. That's any data that could potentially identify the child to outside agencies or individuals.
So very tight controls.
Very tight. And schools are also required to keep a log documenting every instance where students' records were examined, who looked at them, when they looked, and why. This creates an auditable trail for accountability and ensures compliance with the privacy laws. Hashtag 3.3 assessment accommodations, ensuring true measurement.
Okay, let's circle back to something you mentioned. Accommodations. IDA requires students with disabilities to be included in assessments, even the big state tests. How does that work if their disability makes taking the standard test difficult?
That's where accommodations come in. Accommodations are basically adjustments made to the testing conditions or the way the test is administered. They're required by IDA for students with disabilities who participate in state and district-wide assessments, and they're also crucial for many diagnostic tests.
And the goal isn't to make the test easier.
Absolutely not. That's the fundamental principle, the non-negotiable rule. Accommodations are not designed to give a student an unfair advantage or inflate their score. They are purely intended to remove the barrier created by the disability itself, allowing the student to demonstrate the knowledge and skills they actually possess.
So the accommodation shouldn't change what the test is actually measuring.
Precisely. The accommodation must not change the underlying skill or construct being measured by the test. If it does, it invalidates the test result.
Could you give that scribe example again? I thought that illustrated it well.
Sure. Let's say you have a high school student with severe cerebral palsy, making writing physically very difficult and slow. If they're taking a test on, say, American history, and the test's purpose is to measure their knowledge of historical events and concepts, then providing a scribe, someone who writes down the student's dictated answers, is an appropriate response accommodation. It removes the physical writing barrier.
Okay, that makes sense.
But if that same student were taking a test specifically designed to measure their fine motor skills or their handwriting legibility, then providing a scribe would be completely inappropriate. It would change the very thing the test is trying to measure, rendering the score meaningless for that purpose.
Got it. The accommodation has to fit the purpose of the test and the student's need. So what kinds of accommodations are there? Our sources mentioned 4 types.
That's right. They're typically categorized into 4 main types to help organize the possibilities. First, you have presentation accommodations. These change the format of the information being presented to the student.
Like for kids with vision problems.
Exactly. Or auditory processing issues, or even attention difficulties. Examples would include increasing the font size or spacing on the test paper, providing a braille version, using specialized text-to-speech software or audio recordings of the questions, or even just highlighting the key instructions to help them focus.
Okay, presentation. What's next?
Second are response accommodations. These change the way the student is allowed to submit their answers.
We mentioned the scribe. What else?
Right, the scribe is one example. Others include allowing the student to use a word processor or speech-to-text software instead of handwriting, permitting the use of a basic calculator on a math test if the test is measuring problem solving, not calculation skill itself, or letting the student audio record their answers instead of writing them.
Okay, type 3.
Third are setting accommodations. These involve changes to the actual location or the conditions of the testing environment.
Ah, like taking the test in a different room.
Exactly. These are often crucial for students with significant attention deficits, like ADHD, or perhaps anxiety or sensory sensitivities. Common examples include preferential seating in the classroom, like near the teacher, away from distractions, allowing the student to take the test in a small group setting or even one-on-one with a proctor, or providing special lighting, acoustics, or noise-reducing headphones to manage sensory input.
Makes sense. And the last type.
Finally, scheduling accommodations. These adjust the timing or the pacing of the assessment.
Extended time.
Extended time is probably the most common one, yes. But it also includes things like allowing the assessment to be broken up and completed over several shorter sessions instead of one long one, permitting frequent breaks during the test, or even varying the order in which different sections or components of the test are administered.
You mentioned food for students with diabetes.
Right. For a student whose medical condition requires it, like diabetes, allowing them to eat specific foods or check blood sugar during the test would fall under scheduling or setting accommodations, ensuring their medical needs don't interfere with their ability to perform.
So lots of options. How does the IEP team decide which ones are appropriate?
The guiding principle, the rule of thumb mentioned in the sources, is consistency. The accommodations chosen for a formal assessment, especially a high-stakes one, should ideally be the same, or at least very similar to those that the student routinely needs and uses successfully during their regular classroom instruction and testing.
So it shouldn't be a surprise on test day.
Exactly. The decision is always driven by the individual student's documented needs, based on assessment data and observations, not just by preference or trying to game the system. It's about leveling the playing field, not tilting it.
Okay, we've covered the why, the what, the how, and the legal rules. Now comes maybe the trickiest part. Interpretation. You get this report with scores. What do they actually mean? Raw scores are kind of meaningless until you compare them to something, right?
Absolutely. Test scores only gain meaning within a specific comparison framework. We need a benchmark or a reference point to understand if a score is high, low, average, or, concerning. #####4.1 norm reference assessment comparing to peer.
So what's the first major framework? The sources talk about norm reference tests.
Right. Norm reference assessment is a very common type, especially in diagnostic testing for eligibility. This approach provides meaning to an individual student's score by comparing it directly to the performance of a specific normative group.
Normative group, meaning?
Meaning a large, carefully selected, standardized sample of the student's peers, typically other children of the same age or in the same grade level across the country. The test developers give the test to this large norm group first to establish the typical range of scores.
Ah, okay. So it's like grading on a curve, comparing you to everyone else who took it.
In a way, yes. The key is that these tests are highly standardized. The administration procedures, the instructions, the timing, everything, and the scoring rules are absolutely consistent for every single person who takes the test. This standardization is what allows for that meaningful comparison to the norm group.
And the scores are often reported as percentiles.
Percentiles are very common, yes. Think of it like lining up everyone in the norm group from lowest score to highest score. The percentile rank tells you what percentage of that group scored below the individual student.
So the example given was a WISC-4 score. That's an IQ test, right?
Yes, the Wessler Intelligence Scale for Children.
If a student scores at the 64th percentile on the WISC-4 FADE, what does that mean?
It means that students scored higher than 63% of the children in the standardized peer group, same age kids, who took that same test during its development. So slightly above average compared to their peers on that specific measure. The value is purely relative. How do they stack up against others like them?
Okay.
Yeah.
But the sources also raise a big caution flag here, especially for students with disabilities.
A very important caution. Using and interpreting norm reference tests requires extreme care with this population. Why? Because the student's disability itself might interfere with their ability to perform on the test.
How so?
Well, think about it. A visual impairment might make it hard to see the test items clearly. Severe anxiety could cripple performance. Even side effects from necessary medication, like drowsiness, could negatively impact focus and speed. In these cases, the standardized score might actually underestimate the student's true underlying abilities.
So the score might reflect the disability, not the ability.
Exactly. You might have a child with perfectly average or even above average cognitive potential, but their score on a timed, visually complex IQ test might come out low simply because of the barriers imposed by the test format interacting with their disability. This is precisely why the law demands multiple data sources, not just one norm reference score.
And the flip side is true too, right? A low score doesn't automatically mean a disability.
Correct. A low percentile ranking doesn't automatically equate to a disability requiring special education. A student might score low because they simply weren't motivated that day, or they were completely unfamiliar with the test format, or maybe they just have a common academic weakness in that specific area. It doesn't necessarily signal a processing disorder or cognitive impairment.
So context is everything.
Context, patterns across multiple assessments, teacher observations, parent input, it all has to be considered together by the IEP team. You can't interpret that norm reference score in a vacuum. Hashtag 4.2 criterion referenced assessment, comparing to a standard.
Okay, so norm reference compares to peers. What's the other main comparison framework? Criterion referenced.
Right. The second major framework is criterion referenced assessment. This approach pivots away entirely from comparing the individual student to a peer group. Instead, it compares the individual's performance to some predetermined, fixed standard or criterion of mastery.
So not are you better than others, but did you meet the benchmark?
Exactly. Think about a driving test. The examiner isn't comparing your parallel parking skills to all the other drivers tested that day. They're comparing your performance to a fixed set of criteria. Did you hit the curb? Did you signal correctly? Did you check your mirrors?
Okay, that makes sense.
Mhm.
So are state achievement tests usually criterion referenced?
Yes. Those big, high-stakes state tests are almost always criterion referenced. They are standardized in their administration, sure, but the interpretation is fundamentally different from a norm reference test. The core question is, did the student master the specific content standards set for their grade level?
And the results aren't usually percentiles, right?
Typically not. They can sometimes be simple pass-fail, like that vision screening we mentioned earlier. Criterion, can you read the 2040 line? Or, more commonly with state tests like the FSA, they report scores across several defined achievement levels. Maybe level 1 through level 5, where each level corresponds to a specific description of how well the student mastered the required curriculum standards. Level 3 might be proficient, level 5 might be mastery, level 1 might indicate significant gaps.
But the same caution applies here too, doesn't it? About disability impacting performance.
Absolutely. Just like with norm reference tests, failure to meet the criterion on a criterion reference test, say, scoring a level 1 on the state math test doesn't automatically tell you why. It might be due to the student's disability directly affecting their test performance. For example, reading difficulties preventing them from understanding the word problems even if they know the math. Or it could simply reflect a general academic weakness or lack of effort.
So again, the IEP team has to dig deeper.
Always, they have to triangulate the data. Does this low criterion reference score align with classroom performance, teacher observations, other assessments? Or does it seem like an outlier potentially explained by the testing situation or the disability's impact? Discerning the root cause is the team's critical job. Hashtag type 4.3, other comparison types and measurement concepts.
So we have comparison to peers, norm referenced, and comparison to a standard, criterion referenced. Are there other ways to frame results?
Yes, there's at least one more important one mentioned, individual referenced assessment. This framework compares a student's score at one point in time to
Themselves.
Exactly, to the same individual score obtained at other points in time. The student essentially serves as their own control group.
Where would we see this used most often?
We see this framework used constantly in progress monitoring. Remember we talked about tracking reading fluency week by week. When a teacher keeps a running record or a graph of a student's words read correctly per minute over several weeks, They are using individual reference data. They're looking for growth relative to that student's own previous performance. Is the trend line going up? That's the key question.
Got it. Comparing you to you. The sources also mentioned performance-based assessment. How does that fit in?
Performance-based assessment isn't so much a comparison framework as it is a type of assessment task.
Yeah.
It's distinct from multiple choice or short answer tests because it requires the student to actually do something tangible to exhibit a behavior or create a product.
Like writing an essay.
Yep. Writing an essay, conducting a science experiment, giving an oral presentation, creating a portfolio of artwork, performing a musical piece, participating in a debate. All of these require the student to demonstrate skills in action.
And evaluating these seems more subjective.
It inherently is more subjective than scoring a multiple choice test, yes. That's why clear rubrics become absolutely essential for performance-based assessment.
Ah, rubrics. Let's connect this to those core measurement concepts. Reliability and validity. How do rubrics help?
Great connection. Reliability, remember, is about consistency. Does the assessment yield consistent results? For a subjective task like grading an essay, different teachers might give wildly different grades to the same paper, or even the same teacher might grade differently on Monday versus Friday. That's low reliability.
So the rubric.
A detailed, well-defined rubric provides specific criteria for each performance level. For example, what constitutes an A introduction? What demonstrates developing use of evidence? By forcing scorers to evaluate against those same explicit standards, the rubric makes the scoring much more consistent over time and across different students and scores. It significantly boosts the reliability of evaluating performance-based tasks.
Makes sense. And what about validity? That's about whether the test measures what it's supposed to measure, right?
Exactly. Validity is arguably even more important. Does the assessment accurately reflect the construct or skill it claims to assess? Our sources give a good example here.
The teacher worried about the low score.
Right. A teacher is concerned because a student scored very low on a standardized timed math test, but that same student functions quite well, maybe even excels, during regular math class when they have more time and can use different strategies. The teacher is essentially questioning the test's predictive validity.
Does this low score actually predict how the student will perform in real-world math situations?
Precisely. If the test score doesn't align with or predict their actual functioning, its validity for making important educational decisions about that student is questionable. For any assessment tool to be truly useful and fair, especially in high-stakes special education decisions, it absolutely must be both reliable, consistent, and valid, accurate for its purpose.
So we know standardized tests, whether norm or criterion referenced, are widely used, but they clearly have limitations, especially for diverse learners. The sources even mention some specific criticisms.
They do, and it's important context. Critics argue that many traditional standardized tests, particularly multiple-choice formats, tend to enforce somewhat arbitrary time limits, which inherently penalize students who are accurate but process information more slowly.
Right, speed isn't always the same as understanding.
Exactly. Critics also say these tests often prioritize simple recall of isolated facts over deeper critical thinking or reflection. And sometimes the multiple-choice format itself can trivialize complex knowledge by forcing it into a single correct answer bubble, implying there's only one way to solve a problem when often there isn't. Hashtag 5-5.1 criticisms and alternative assessments.
Given these criticisms, it makes sense that we need alternative ways to gather information. What are some key alternatives? The sources mention observation.
Yes, observational assessment is a crucial category of alternatives. Instead of relying solely on what a student does in a structured test setting, this involves systematically watching and recording their behavior in more natural, real-world settings, usually the classroom, but sometimes other school environments too.
And the goal is objective description.
Ideally, yes. Trying to capture what the student actually does, rather than just interpreting it immediately. There are several specific methods used for observational assessment.
Like checklists.
Right. Checklists are pretty simple. They just note the presence or absence of specific predefined behaviors during the observation period. Did the student make eye contact? Yes, no. Did they raise their hand? Yes, no.
Okay. What else?
Rating scales go a bit further. Instead of just yes, no, they ask the observer to rate the extent or frequency of a behavior, often on a numerical scale, like rating a student's level of participation from 1 low to 5 high.
Okay.
Then there are methods focused on time. Duration records measure the total amount of time a student spends engaged in specific behavior, like how many minutes were they actually working on the assignment during a 30-minute independent work period. This is great for tracking things like time on task.
Time sampling.
Time sampling records are a bit different. The observer divides the observation period into short intervals, say every 30 seconds, and simply records whether the target behavior occurred at all during that brief interval. It gives you an estimate of frequency without having to count every single instance.
Okay. And the last one mentioned was anecdotal records.
Right. Anecdotal records are more narrative. They involve writing down brief, objective narrative descriptions of specific incidents or behaviors shortly after they occur. They often capture important contextual details that a simple checklist or rating scale might miss, like what happened right before the student acted out.
These observational methods sound really useful for getting a sense of how a student functions day to day.
They are. And they feed directly into another important approach called ecological assessment.
Ecological, like environment.
Exactly. Ecological assessment doesn't just look at the student in isolation or in only one setting. It specifically focuses on how the student functions in different environments or contexts.
Why is that important?
Because behavior is often context dependent. An ecological approach tries to identify which settings or conditions seem particularly difficult for the student and why. What are the environmental triggers or supports?
Can you give the example from the source? The student with mild autism.
Yeah, that's a perfect illustration. Imagine observing a student with mild autism who struggles with peer interactions. If you only watch them in the highly structured, quiet math classroom, you might not see many issues. But if you also observe them during the noisy, unstructured, socially complex environment of the cafeteria or the playground, you might see exactly where and why the conflicts are happening.
So maybe it's the noise level or the lack of clear social rules in those settings.
Precisely. The ecological assessment helps pinpoint those environmental variables, allowing the team to plan targeted environmental modifications, like maybe allowing the student to eat lunch in a quieter space, rather than just focusing solely on teaching the student social skills out of context.
That makes a lot of sense.
Ah.
What about authentic assessment?
Authentic assessment is another key alternative. This moves away from contrived test questions and instead requires students to perform tasks that simulate or actually are real-life applications of their knowledge and skills.
Like the budgeting example.
Right. Instead of a worksheet full of abstract percentage problems, an authentic math assessment might involve having the student maintain a simulated household budget for a month or calculate the materials needed for a real-world construction project. The goal is to measure if the student can actually use their learning in meaningful ways.
And rubrics are key here too.
Absolutely essential for authentic assessment. Because the tasks are complex and often open-ended, clear rubrics are needed to define the expectations for quality work, guide the student's efforts, and provide specific, constructive feedback. And as we discussed, they also make the scoring much more reliable and fair. Hashtag 5.2 curriculum-based measurement, CBM, and IEP goals.
Okay, let's pivot back to a specific tool that the sources highlight as being particularly powerful, especially for tracking progress. Curriculum-based measurement, or CBM. What exactly is it?
CBM is a very specific, highly standardized, and research-validated method of progress monitoring. Its key feature is that it directly measures a student's performance and growth on skills taken directly from their general education curriculum.
So it's tied right to what they're supposed to be learning in class.
Exactly, which makes it inherently criterion referenced. You're measuring mastery of curriculum skills. It's not comparing them to a national norm group on some abstract test. It's comparing their performance to expected benchmarks within their actual curriculum.
And you mentioned it's standardized and frequent.
Yes, that's the CBM system. Performance samples are collected very frequently, typically 1 to 3 times per week. And the probes, or mini-tests, are extremely brief, usually lasting only 1 to 5 minutes each.
1 to 5 minutes, that's it.
Yep. The brevity is key. It minimizes disruption to actual teaching time, but maximizes the amount of reliable data you can collect on student progress over time.
Can you give that oral reading fluency example again? How does CBM work for that?
Sure. For oral reading fluency, ORF, a common CBM method involves having the student read aloud from 3 different equivalent passages taken from their grade-level curriculum material, each for exactly 1 minute. This might happen once a week.
And how is it scored?
The scoring is standardized. The teacher, or trained assistant, counts the total number of words the student read correctly and fluently within that minute and subtracts any errors, like mispronunciations, skipped words, etc. To get the single data point for that week, they typically use the median, the middle score, of the three one-minute readings.
Okay, so you get to score like words correct per minute.
Exactly. And you graph that score each week. Over time, you get a clear visual representation of the student's progress, or lack thereof.
What are the big advantages of using CBM, according to the sources?
There are several really significant advantages that make it so valuable for IEP teams. First, as we said, it's quick and easy to administer and score. Second, there are well-established CBM procedures for the most critical academic areas: reading, spelling, writing, math computation. Third, because it is standardized, the results are reliable and objectively comparable over time and even across different interventions.
And easy to understand.
Yes, that's another big plus. The results are typically presented in a simple graph format: time on the bottom axis, score on the vertical axis. It's very easy for teachers, parents, and even older students themselves to literally see the progress being made. It's much more intuitive than trying to interpret complex standard score reports.
And the connection to IEPs. How does CBM help with writing those goals?
This is perhaps the most powerful application. Because CBM provides such frequent, standardized, sensitive, and curriculum-relevant data, teachers can use those graphs to quickly and accurately determine if their instruction is actually working for that individual student. Is the student's trend line moving towards the goal line?
So you can adjust instruction faster if needed.
Exactly. And critically, for the IEP document itself, this allows the team to write both the short-term benchmarks, or objectives, and the long-term annual goals directly in terms of specific, measurable CBM scores.
Can you give an example of a CBM-based IEP goal?
Sure. A goal might read something like, by the end of the school year, when given a grade-level reading passage, students' name will read orally at a rate of 90 words correct per minute with fewer than 5 errors, as measured by weekly CBM probes.
Wow, that's incredibly specific and measurable.
It is. It makes the goal crystal clear, easy to monitor, and legally defensible because it's tied directly to ongoing objective data collection based on the curriculum. CBM provides the data to both set ambitious but realistic goals and track progress towards achieving them.
Okay, so CBM and other tools work well for monitoring progress for many students with disabilities who are working within the general curriculum, maybe with accommodations. But what about students with the most significant cognitive impairments? They might not be expected to master the standard grade-level curriculum, even with lots of support.
That's a crucial distinction. While ID mandates inclusion in assessments for most students with disabilities, often using the accommodations we discussed, there is a recognition that for a small percentage of students, specifically those identified as having the most severe cognitive impairments, participation in the standard state assessment, even with accommodations, just isn't appropriate or meaningful.
So there's an alternative path for them.
Yes. States are required to provide an alternate assessment pathway for these students.
Sure.
Our source material uses the example of Florida's system called the Florida Alternate Assessment, or FAA, but every state has a similar mechanism.
And who decides if a student should take this alternate assessment instead of the standard one?
That decision is made by the student's IEP team. And it's a very serious decision, not made lightly. The sources emphasize that the IEP team must rigorously review the student against a specific set of strict criteria before determining that the alternate assessment is the appropriate route. This ensures it's reserved for the students for whom it's truly intended.
What are those criteria? It sounds like there are several hurdles.
There are. Based on the Florida example provided, there are essentially 5 key criteria that all generally need to be met. First, the IEP team must determine that the student cannot master the general curriculum standards, like the Florida standards, even when provided with extensive allowable accommodations.
Okay, criterion 1. Can't meet standards even with help.
Right. Second, the team must conclude that the student's cognitive limitations are the primary reason for this inability to master the standards. If the main barrier is, say, a physical disability or a language difference, but their cognitive ability is potentially higher, they should generally be attempting the standard assessment with accommodations, not the alternate.
Got it. Primary reason must be cognitive. What's third?
Third, the student must currently be participating in a highly modified curriculum. This curriculum isn't just accommodations. It's based on fundamentally different learning goals derived from what Florida calls access points. These are essentially key concepts from the general curriculum, but broken down to a significantly reduced level of complexity, specifically designed for students with severe cognitive disabilities.
So, different curriculum expectations. Number 4.
Fourth, the student requires extensive direct instruction across a very broad spectrum of life skills. This isn't just academic support. It includes intensive teaching in vocational skills, domestic or daily living skills, social interaction skills, and even leisure activities. They need constant focused teaching across multiple life domains.
Okay, extensive instruction needs. And the last criterion.
And fifth, the team determines that the student is unable to function effectively and independently across a variety of settings, even with support. If the answer to all five of these is essentially yes, then the student likely qualifies for and requires the specialized alternate assessment pathway like the FAA.
That's a very high bar.
Mm.
So what is the FAA actually like? Is it a bubble test?
No, typically not. Alternate assessments like the FAA are usually performance-based. They often require teachers to collect evidence of the student's learning over the course of the school year, perhaps through a portfolio of work samples, structured observations of the student performing specific tasks linked to those access point skills, or checklists documenting their skill mastery.
And how are the results reported? Is it just pass-fail?
No, the FAA results, according to the source, are reported across 9 distinct performance levels, which are then grouped into 3 broader score categories to give a general sense of mastery on those modified access point standards.
What are those 3 categories?
The lowest 3 levels fall under emergent. This indicates the student is just beginning to develop the skills related to those access points and still requires frequent physical or verbal cueing and prompting from the instructor to demonstrate them.
Okay, emergent, middle group.
The middle 3 levels are grouped as achieved. This means the student is successfully acquiring and applying those specific access point skills with moderate success and is showing increasing independence in using them.
And the top group.
The highest 3 levels are labeled commended. This signifies that the student has not only mastered those specific access point skills, but can also generalize them, meaning they can apply the knowledge and skills successfully across different settings or contexts related to their modified curriculum. It represents high success within that alternate framework. Hashtag tag outro.
So when you step back and look at it all, we've really covered a lot of ground today. We started with those fundamental legal mandates from IDEA, things like requiring parental consent, ensuring non-discriminatory practices, demanding multiple data sources.
Right, and the importance of trained evaluators and validated tools. Exactly. Then we move through the distinct purposes of assessment. Screening to cast the wide net, pre-referral to try interventions first, diagnostic for that deep dive, progress monitoring for tracking growth, and outcome evaluation for the final judgment.
Understanding why you're assessing dictates how you assess.
Precisely. And finally, we touched on interpreting those results using different frameworks, comparing to norms, comparing to criteria, comparing to the individual, and looked at powerful alternative tools like observation, ecological assessment, and especially curriculum-based measurement, which gives us that direct link from data to actionable, measurable, and transparent IEP goals.
It really is a complex system.
It is undeniably complex and demanding for everyone involved, educators, families, and students. But at its core, it's a system fundamentally built on trying to uphold legal and ethical principles. The goal, however imperfectly achieved sometimes, is to protect every student's right to an appropriate education by accurately identifying their needs and ensuring the support provided actually helps them reach their potential.
So, thinking about the big picture, what does this all mean for you, our listener? I think the key takeaway is that assessment in special education isn't a one-off event. It's not static. It should be this dynamic, multifaceted, continuous loop.
A loop?
Yeah. It's designed ideally to ensure maximum fairness through legal safeguards, to pinpoint precise needs, not just vague weaknesses, and then to constantly, relentlessly measure the effectiveness of the very specific support being provided. It's this complex but absolutely necessary process that attempts to translate a student's legal rights under IDEA into tangible, real educational outcomes.
Well said.
So to leave you with one final provocative thought to maybe mull over based on everything we've discussed today, when you next find yourself looking at a student's assessment results, maybe it's a standardized test score, norm-referenced or criterion-referenced, take a moment to consider the accommodations. Specifically, consider the accommodations that were not provided.
Interesting angle.
Ask yourself, did the absence of a specific accommodation that this student might genuinely need, maybe it was extended time they didn't get, or perhaps being tested in a small group setting wasn't offered, or maybe they weren't allowed to use a simple calculator they rely on in class, did that absence potentially interfere with the test's ability to accurately measure that student's actual knowledge or skill? Could it be that the final score you're looking at is, in part, an assessment of the disability's impact rather than a true measure of the student's underlying ability? Something to think about.